Okay, so today in class you guys read chapters 13, section 1 and section 2. And so in this video we're going to go back and look at maybe some of the important things that you should have pulled out from those two sections. So section 1 is entitled Cultures Clash on the Prairie. And really what that's looking at is Native Americans' culture and how that was different than white culture and how that led to conflict, as well as how settlers began to push west, that conflict of competing for land and the same resources, and then ultimately how the destruction of the buffalo gave rise to the cattle industry and into the open range, and really an end to Native American resistance on the plains. So that's where we'll kind of start with our focus there. If we move up and we look at Native American versus white culture. Native Americans, culturally, the buffalo was very important. It was vital to their way of life. The buffalo, the skins were used for clothing, for shoes. The hides were used for teepees. The bones were used for tools. The meats became a staple of the Native American diet. So it was so essential. As because the buffalo is so essential, the buffalo is an animal that roams. Most of the Native Americans on the plains, most of those tribes tended to be nomadic, which means they followed the buffalo. They didn't have a permanent settlement, like Native American groups back east. So because they're nomadic, this oftentimes brought them into conflict with white settlers, as well as other Native American groups on the plains. Culturally, the biggest difference between Native Americans and white settlers was their view of land ownership. Native Americans did not believe that you could own land. They thought that land was held in common, and they thought it was something that, again, couldn't be owned. It was used to be used to share in the benefits of the land. Where obviously white settlers are going to take a much different view on land ownership. White settlers typically believed that owning land, starting a business, that's how you made a stake in a country. And they're going to argue against Native Americans later on, saying that, hey, you didn't build any settlements, you didn't do anything to improve the land, so therefore you're kind of giving up your stake in the country. They use that kind of as their rationale for making the argument that the plains was kind of an unsettled area that was there for the taking for the United States. It was there to kind of claim the land for U.S. citizens. So again, a little bit different of a view. As far as the Native Americans came into contact with white settlers, we're going to have a couple of things. First, in 1864, which I believe you looked at today on the worksheet you did, we have the Sand Creek Massacre. And basically, long story short, at the Sand Creek Massacre, you've got a couple different Native American groups retreating to the Sand Creek Reserve for the winter. Once there, they thought that they were under the protection of the United States government. However, you're going to have a U.S. Army commander that's going to order kind of an assault on the groups that are there, and ultimately 150 of inhabitants of the reserve are going to be killed. Most of those 150 are women and children. And so it becomes known as kind of Sand Creek Massacre. It was a little bit of an unprovoked attack by the United States government. We also have incidents along the Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail was a common trail to the west for a lot of settlers, white settlers, but it ran right through the Sioux hunting grounds. And so as these settlers would travel along the trail, they needed just little settlements to stop, to, I mean, people could make a profit by creating a little settlement and then offering services to settlers as they went along the trail. The Sioux didn't like this. They lobbied the United States government more than once to try to end settlement on the Bozeman Trail. However, to no avail. Finally, it's going to come to kind of a violent head where you're going to have a Native American leader by the name of Crazy Horse, who's going to ambush a gentleman. It's Captain Fetterman. I forget his first name. Crazy Horse is going to ambush Captain Fetterman and his men, and ultimately, basically kill 80 soldiers. It wasn't a big party Captain Fetterman had. Skirmishes kind of similar to that are going to continue on the Bozeman Trail for some time. It's successful in that it does eventually get the United States government to agree to close the Bozeman Trail to U.S. settlement. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is the treaty that is supposed to do this. Basically, under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Sioux agreed to live on the reservation along the Missouri River. However, they still expected to use their traditional hunting grounds, which means that the Sioux didn't really follow the treaty. They kind of did what they wanted and still ventured off the reservation onto these hunting grounds. And so the Treaty of Fort Laramie is somewhat successful in that it does briefly offer an end to fighting along the Bozeman Trail, but conflict's going to ultimately continue for Native Americans. We're going to have just several incidents of fighting, whether it be the Red River War, which ultimately crushed Native American resistance on the Southern Plains. But you're going to have more and more settlers spilling into the area. We're going to have the gold rush in the Black Hills region. That's going to cause people to go into that Black Hills region, which is where we have the famous Custer's Last Stand. Basically, General George Custer is going to encounter some Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Those warriors are led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And George Custer is going to come across these warriors at the Little Bighorn River. And so it's the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, is what's going to result. Basically, the Sioux and the Cheyenne are going to have the upper hand in this affair. They're going to end up surrounding Custer's troops in under an hour. Custer and all his men are dead. They're done. So that's very shocking to the American people. It kind of starts to drum up some anti-Native American sentiment amongst the people. And so you're going to have that going on. However, that kind of victory for the Sioux or for Native Americans is short-lived. Later that same year of Custer's Last Stand, so late 1876, you're going to have Sitting Bull and his followers that are after Custer's Last Stand. Sitting Bull and his followers escape up into Canada. They come back when their people are starving, and they're eventually arrested. And so it's kind of a short-lived victory for them. As far as why settlers, so if we're moving over here to why settlers began to push west, they were mainly going there for riches. I mean, gold and silver had been discovered, and so that's going to cause people to want to move into that area. However, again, as more people come into the area, it's going to lead to conflict. so much conflict, the United States begins to kind of change its policy on Native Americans in the region. Remember, thinking back to Andrew Jackson, policy of Indian removal. This was supposed to be just a big Indian reservation. The Great Plains were supposed to be a big Indian reservation. We start to change that. Um, in the 1850s, the United States government begins to shift their policy from one of having the Great Plains as a big Native American reservation to one of establishing treaties and then setting boundaries for the different tribes on the plains, which again is going to be problematic because these groups are nomadic. They want to follow the buffalo, so that's kind of a problem. Eventually, the United States government is going to establish a policy of assimilation. Assimilation is just where you take the Native Americans and you try to make them give up their way of a life to become part of more white culture. And so, again, the Dawes Act establishes assimilation as their policy. Um, Basically, assimilation was established by the United States breaking up reservations and giving more of land to individual Native Americans. And then what they actually did, and kind of the bad part about it, is then they took the rest of that land and gave it to white settlers. So that wasn't a good thing. The income from the sale of that land was supposed to go to Native Americans, rarely did it. So it was kind of a bad deal. The other thing, and kind of a more of the, I think one of the more sad parts about assimilation was to accomplish it. Oftentimes they took children away from their families, put them in American schools, made them speak English, those types of things to try to assimilate them to white culture. So kind of a sad deal. And if you just look at the numbers of where we're at with our Native American population, a lot of it has its roots in this era as far as what we did to Native Americans as a country. So settlers are pushing west because of U.S. policy. Many Native Americans are poor. They're suffering from disease, and this was true of the Sioux. And basically, the Sioux, who were very poor, they were suffering from a lot of disease, turned to a prophet who basically promised the Sioux that if they performed a ritual called the Ghost Dance, Native American lands and their way of life would be restored. And so this leads to this Ghost Dance movement across the Dakota reservation of the Sioux. The armed military leaders that are kind of monitoring the reservation become alarmed. They actually arrest Sitting Bull, who had come back from Canada. But things kind of go awry after that. Sitting Bull's bodyguard actually shoots one of the Native American police trying to arrest him, and the police then kill Sitting Bull. In the aftermath, a bunch of Sioux flee, and basically what ensues becomes known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. Specifically, again, if we're looking at it, it happened on December 28th of 1890. Basically, the 7th Cavalry is going to round up about 350 starving and freezing Sioux. They take them to Wounded Knee. The next day, the soldiers are going to demand that the natives give up all their weapons. All of a sudden, a shot is fired. Again, history is a little murky on who fired first. Thinking back to the Boston Massacre, we don't exactly know who fired first. The soldiers fire cannons down on the Native Americans from above. Within minutes, 300 of the Native Americans, most of them are unarmed, are basically slaughtered. Again, kind of a bad mark in U.S. history here. The soldiers leave the Native American bodies on the ground to freeze. Again, it's December in South Dakota. It's cold. And again, it becomes known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. Significance here, Battle of Wounded Knee, very important. It does end the era of Indian wars on the plains to an end. So significant with that. So lastly, we're looking at we looked at how the buffalo was so important to Native Americans, and we've kind of looked at how as white settlers encroached, that hurt Native Americans. Well, as white settlers move into the area, they begin to hunt buffalo for some for sport, some for the fur trade. But the number of buffalo on the plains greatly reduces. For example, in 1800, there were approximately 65 million buffalo on the plains. By 1890, there were fewer than 1,000. Again, if you think how important the buffalo was to the Native Americans, you kind of realize that the buffalo numbers going down is not going to be a good thing for them. So as these great herds of buffalo start to disappear, the Native Americans are going to be forced onto smaller, less desirable tracts of land, and you're going to see the expansion of the cattle industry on the plains. And cattle is going to become big business. It's going to there's going to be a especially after the Civil War, growing demand for beef. So the cattle industry is going to rise. We're going to have the birth of cow towns on the plains. The Chisholm Trail is going to be one of the great trails to move cattle from Kansas into other places. So we have this expansion of the cattle industry, expansion of ranching. However, almost as quickly as the cattle herds had multiplied and ranching had become big business, the cattle frontier really meets its end. One, and this happens quite a bit in our history, we get a little too excited. With the cattle industry, we overgrazed a lot of the land. That coupled with extended bad weather and the invention of barbed wire, which, again, we're ending the open range. With barbed wire, you're fencing in land. That really brings an end to the open range. So that's a quick, probably not as quick as I would like to have been, summary of section 1. If we look at section 2 of where do I want to put myself? We'll put there. Section 2 of chapter 13, which is really a little bit easier to look at. We're looking at the settlement on the Great Plains. Really, the first to open the Great Plains to settlement were the railroads. This is the era of the Transcontinental Railroad. From 1850 to 1871, the federal government made huge land grants to the Central and Union Pacific Railroads, again, to build a railroad to the coast. The railroads then in turn sold that land to farmers to make a profit, usually between $2 and $10 an acre. They also, to encourage settlement, and that's why you see like pockets, and it's kind of the neat thing, why you see German pockets in certain parts of the state or Irish pockets, because the railroads were smart. They wanted people to live in that land. They would send agents out to Europe to attract settlers in. So just again, example, 44% of settlers in Nebraska were immigrants. More than 70% of those in Minnesota and Wisconsin were immigrants. So again, they're trying to attract people from other places in. So again, it's not a real desirable place to live. And so the railroads are opening in the West. The government is also trying to do its part in attracting settlers into the area. The Homestead Act is passed in 1862, which basically offered 160 acres of land for free. So you get 160 acres for free to any citizen or intended citizen. So that's where the immigrants come in. Again, all you had to do was improve the land. So that was their way to encourage people to settle on land, and it was somewhat successful. From 1862 to 1900, 600,000 families will take advantage of this offer. The first actual homestead under the Homestead Act is in Nebraska. It's down kind of by Beatrice. Daniel J. Freeman was the man's name that established the first homestead under the Homestead Act. So that's kind of cool. Many of the people that take advantage of the Homestead Act are what's known as exodusters. And these are African Americans. Many of them were former slaves that are looking to escape kind of the post-war South. The United States government also realized that the land, Great Plains, and we'll see kind of here in a minute, it's much different, and so they had to think of different ways and to educate people about how to use that land. That's where the Morrill Act comes into play. And so the the Morrill Act was about agricultural education. It was issued in 1862 and then reauthorized again in 1890. And it was it gave the federal land to states to help finance agricultural colleges. So all your generally your state universities like Iowa State, that's an agricultural college. That's where they got their funding from or their start from. The Hatch Act of 1887 is another kind of lesser known act that just established experimental stations to inform farmers of new developments. So again, the Great Plains is a much different region. I mean, if you've driven across state of Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, you realize that they're different than states in the East if you've driven across those states. And hopefully you've realized a couple of things. A, the Great Plains, they're relatively flat. I mean, plains, we should kind of figure that out. So the Great Plains are relatively flat. It's also relatively treeless. If you look out, and I remember driving across South Dakota with my dad when I was much younger, and he was just shocked that there were no trees out there. But literally, it's relatively treeless. So it has that part to it. The other part, and it may have changed a little bit, we may, excuse me, not change, but we may not realize this as much because we're really on the edge of what would be defined as the Great Plains here in Omaha. But as you go further west, there's not a lot of water. There's not a lot of rain. There's not a lot of moisture. So it's relatively dry. So it's relatively it's relatively flat, treeless, and it's dry. And so that is going to create unique challenges. Basically, the three legs metaphor is just this idea that east of the Mississippi, society stood on three legs. The one leg was land. The second leg was water. The third leg was timber. Now, if you move to the Great Plains and think about a tripod, if you take a leg off of a tripod, it's going to fall down. And he was basically saying that on the Great Plains, you're going to remove one of those, or two of those actually. You're going to remove water, and you're going to remove timber. And so society's got to adapt. And so there's all kinds of adaptations in Section 2 that are mentioned, whether it be dugouts and soddies as the type of home that didn't require timber, whether it be the steel plow, whether it be the mechanical reaper that is going to help life on the plains, the grain drill, barbed wire, the corn binder, the steel windmill that allowed you to pump up water so your crops would not die. So all kinds of adaptations that had to be made to make life hospitable on the Great Plains, to kind of change it from this great American desert type imagery that a lot of people had. So lastly, and this is kind of where we'll pick up with tomorrow, is the problems and the debt problems that a lot of farmers had. Basically, and maybe we do, maybe we don't know, but farming equipment is expensive, and it's so expensive that a lot of times farmers had to borrow money to purchase it. So when prices for agricultural products were high, farmers had no trouble repaying their loans. When prices fell, farmers had to produce more to make their ends meet. Well, again, fundamental economic lesson here. The more you produce, the lower price you're gonna get for something, and that was dangerous. So their prices went down. We also had the rise of bonanza farming, which is basically enormous single crop farms, which means they weren't diversified. So if that crop failed, obviously you were going to struggle. We also went through a period in the 1800s of a severe drought, and that's going to cause problems for farmers as well. Railroads, who are going to be an enemy of farms, will also kind of come up, and we'll talk more specifically about that tomorrow. But basically, railroads, they could charge whatever fee they wanted for a farmer to ship their products, which again, it created problems because they felt pressure to produce more, which means they had to borrow more money to get the machinery to produce more. So they went further into debt, prices went further down, and that is going to give rise to our populist movement, which again is what we're going to look at tomorrow.